My daughter-in-law smiled sweetly as she handed me a dinner tray and pointed toward the cramped quarters behind the kitchen where the help used to stay. "Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with false kindness, "you'll be much more comfortable back there. The main house can get so drafty for someone your age." My son Thomas just nodded along, avoiding my eyes like he'd been doing for months. So I took that tray, walked to those tiny rooms without a word, and made one phone call that would remind them exactly whose name was still on every deed, every bank account, and every legal document they'd forgotten about. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined at 72 years old that I'd be eating my dinner off a plastic tray in the servants' quarters of my own family estate. The Whitmore Manor had been in our family for 4 generations, passed down from my great-grandfather who built it with his own hands after striking oil in the Texas Panhandle back in 1889. Every brick, every board, every piece of crown molding held memories that belonged to me, and now I was being treated like an unwelcome guest in my own home. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I spent 47 years of my life loving a man who taught me that dignity wasn't something you demanded from others. It was something you carried within yourself. My late husband, William, passed 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack while tending to his prized rose garden. The day we buried him, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. I was wrong. The trouble started 6 months after the funeral, when my son Thomas brought home his new wife, a 28-year-old marketing executive named Sophia Chen, who worked for some tech startup in Austin. She had perfectly straight black hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place, designer clothes that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. At first, I was genuinely happy for Thomas. He was 35 and had been single for so long that I'd started to worry he'd never find someone to share his life with. Sophia seemed smart and accomplished, and she made him laugh in a way I hadn't seen since his father died. But there were little things that bothered me from the beginning, though I told myself I was just being an overprotective mother. The way she'd walk through the manor taking photos of everything, claiming she was just documenting the beautiful architecture for her Instagram followers. How she'd ask pointed questions about the property taxes and the cost of maintaining such a large estate. The way she'd steer conversations toward how difficult it must be for me to manage everything, on my own at my age. When Thomas announced they were getting married after only 4 months of dating, I bit my tongue and smiled. When he suggested they have the wedding at the manor to save money, I opened my home and my checkbook. When Sophia started talking about how much sense it would make for them to move in with me since the house was so big and I was all alone, I convinced myself it was actually a wonderful idea. The first few weeks after they moved in were pleasant enough. Sophia would make coffee in the mornings and ask about my plans for the day. Thomas seemed happier than I'd seen him in years, and the house felt alive again with young voices and laughter echoing through the halls. But slowly, things began to change. It started with small suggestions. Sophia mentioned that the formal dining room would make a perfect home office for Thomas since he was working remotely now. She thought, the sitting room off the master bedroom would be ideal for her yoga practice and meditation. The library, she said, got the most beautiful afternoon light and would be perfect for her conference calls. Before I knew it, I was gradually being nudged out of the spaces I'd occupied for decades. My morning coffee routine in the sunroom was interrupted by Thomas taking important calls there. My afternoon reading time in the library was cut short by Sophia's work meetings. Even the kitchen, which had always been my domain, became a source of tension when Sophia decided to meal prep for the week and needed the entire space for hours at a time. But the real turning point came on a crisp October evening when we were expecting guests for dinner. I'd planned a menu, bought groceries, and spent the morning preparing my famous pot roast, the same recipe I'd been making for family gatherings for 30 years. When Sophia came into the kitchen around noon, she looked at my preparations with barely concealed horror. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I was beginning to recognize. "I completely forgot to tell you. I already ordered catering from that new farm-to-table place in town. Thomas and I thought it would be better to have something more contemporary for tonight's guests." I stood there holding a wooden spoon, looking at the roast that had been slowly cooking all morning, and felt something inside me crack. Not break, just crack, like the first sign that a foundation was starting to shift. "I wish you'd told me earlier," I said quietly, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "I've been cooking all morning." Sophia's expression softened into what I now realize was practiced sympathy. "I know, and I'm so sorry. It's just that these are some important contacts from Thomas's work, and we want to make the right impression. You understand, don't you? Maybe we can save your roast for another time when it's just family." Thomas walked in at that moment, his tie loosened after a long day of video conferences. "Something smells amazing in here," he said, then noticed the tension between Sophia and me. "Everything okay?" "Your mother was just telling me about the lovely roast she's been preparing," Sophia said smoothly. "But I explained that we already have the catering handled for tonight." I watched my son's face as he processed this information. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of something. Maybe guilt, maybe conflict, cross his features. But then Sophia moved to his side and slipped her arm through his, and whatever brief moment of backbone he might have had dissolved. "Mom, you know you don't have to go to all this trouble anymore," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Sophia and I can handle the entertaining now. Maybe it's time for you to start taking things a little easier." That phrase, "taking things a little easier," would become a recurring theme in the weeks that followed. Every time I tried to maintain my normal routines, every time I asserted myself in my own home, I was told I should be taking things easier. When I objected to them rearranging the furniture in the living room, I was told I should take things easier. When I questioned why they needed to use my home office as storage for Sophia's exercise equipment, I should take things easier. The final straw came 3 weeks later during Sophia's birthday celebration. She'd invited a dozen of her friends and colleagues to the manor for what she called an intimate dinner party. I offered to help with the preparations, but she assured me everything was under control and that I should just relax and enjoy being a guest in my own home. When her friends arrived, I was introduced simply as Thomas's mother, without any mention. That this was my house, my family's legacy, my home. I watched from the sidelines as Sophia gave tours of the property like she was the lady of the manor, pointing out architectural details and family heirlooms as if she were the expert on 4 generations of Whitmore history. During dinner, seated at my own dining room table that had been set with my grandmother's china, I listened to Sophia hold court about the challenges of maintaining a historic property and the burden of preserving family traditions. Her friends nodded sympathetically as she described the difficult transition of blending modern life with old-fashioned expectations. One of her friends, a sleek woman in her 30s with aggressively highlighted hair, looked down the table, at me with the kind of smile people reserve for elderly relatives at nursing homes. "Eleanor, it must be such a comfort to have Sophia here to help you manage everything. These old houses can be so overwhelming." Before I could respond, Sophia jumped in. "Oh, we're just happy we can be here for her. It's such a big responsibility, and at her age, she shouldn't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep and all the little details that come with a property like this." The conversation continued around me as if I weren't there, with Sophia's friends offering advice about elder care and the importance of family stepping up when aging parents needed support. I sat in my own dining room, eating off my own china, listening to strangers discuss my life and my capabilities, as if I were already incapacitated. After dinner, as I was clearing plates in the kitchen, I overheard Sophia talking to one of her friends near the back door. "The poor thing is just so set in her ways," she was saying, her voice carrying that false concern that had become her signature tone when discussing me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas and I are trying to help her transition to a more manageable lifestyle, but you know how stubborn older people can be about change. Her friend made sympathetic noises. Have you considered assisted living? I know it sounds harsh, but sometimes it's the kindest option. There are some lovely places that don't feel institutional at all. We've talked about it, Sophia replied, and my blood ran cold. But Thomas thinks we should try to make things work here first. Maybe if we can help her understand that she doesn't need to be responsible for everything anymore, she'll be more open to the idea of scaling back. That night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about those words. Scaling back, transitioning to a more manageable lifestyle, the burden of preserving family traditions. Every phrase felt like another shovel full of dirt being thrown on my grave. I thought about William and what he would say if he could see. What was happening to our home, our legacy? He'd always been protective of our family's heritage, spending weekends restoring original features and researching the history of every piece of furniture and every photograph in our collection. The manor wasn't just a house to him. It was a sacred trust that we were meant to preserve and pass down. But somewhere along the way, that trust had been twisted into a burden, and I had been transformed from the keeper of our family's legacy into an obstacle to be managed. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made my coffee in the kitchen before anyone else was awake and sat in the breakfast nook, watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold over the rolling hills of our property. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. Not an aging burden or a stubborn old woman, but Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of Texas oil money, wife of William Whitmore, mother of Thomas, and sole owner of everything as far as the eye could see. That's when I decided it was time to remind everyone exactly who they were dealing with. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 days later, Sophia announced that her parents were coming to visit for the weekend, flying in from San Francisco, where her father worked as some kind of tech executive. She'd been planning the visit for weeks, she said, and wanted everything to be perfect. I've already arranged for a housekeeper to come in and do a deep clean, she told me over breakfast, scrolling through her phone as she talked. And I've made reservations at the country club for Saturday night dinner. I thought it would be nice to show them around town and introduce them to some of the local community leaders. Thomas nodded approvingly. That sounds great, babe. Mom, you'll love Sophia's parents. Her dad has some fascinating stories about the early days of Silicon Valley. I stirred my coffee and said nothing, but something about the way Sophia avoided making eye contact with me set off alarm bells in my head. There was more to this visit than she was telling us. My suspicions were confirmed the next day when I overheard her on a phone call in the garden. I'd gone outside to check on the herb garden that William had planted years ago, and her voice carried clearly across the lawn. I know it's moving fast, Daddy, but this is the opportunity we talked about, she was saying, pacing back and forth near the fountain. The property is worth at least $4 million, maybe more with the right development. Thomas is completely on board, and the old lady is already starting to show signs of confusion. Our lawyer says if we can establish a pattern of diminished capacity, we can probably get guardianship within 6 months. I froze behind the rose bush where I'd been deadheading blooms, my pruning shears still in my hand. Diminished capacity, guardianship, development. The words hit me like physical blows. No, she hasn't been diagnosed with anything yet, Sophia continued. But she's clearly struggling to manage things on her own. Yesterday she forgot to turn off the stove, and last week she couldn't remember where she put her car keys. Thomas is starting to see it too, especially when I point things out to him. Lies. Every word was a lie. I hadn't forgotten to turn off the stove. I'd been interrupted while cooking by one of Sophia's phone calls and had turned it off when I returned to the kitchen 5 minutes later. My car keys hadn't been lost. Sophia had moved them when she was tidying up the entrance hall, and it had taken me 20 minutes to find them. But I realized with growing horror that these small, explainable moments were being collected and catalogued as evidence of my declining mental state. "The timing is perfect with the visit," Sophia was saying. "I want you and Mom to see how she's living, how overwhelmed she is by this place. Thomas is already talking about how much simpler things would be if we could just handle everything for her. Once you meet her, you'll understand why we need to move quickly." I stayed hidden behind the roses until she finished her call and went back into the house, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then I walked on unsteady legs to the small bench by the herb garden and sat down to think. Everything suddenly made sense. The gradual isolation from my own spaces, the constant suggestions that I was struggling to cope, the way Sophia positioned herself as the responsible one who was graciously helping me manage my own life. She wasn't just trying to take over my home, she was building a case to take over my entire existence. And Thomas, my own son, was either too blind to see what was happening or too weak to stop it. That evening, Sophia served dinner on a tray and suggested I might be more comfortable eating in the small sitting room off the kitchen instead of joining them at the dining table. "You've seemed so tired lately," she said, with that same practiced concern. "I thought you might appreciate a quieter evening." The sitting room she was referring to was a tiny space that had originally been designed as quarters for live-in help. It had a small table, a narrow bed, and a bathroom the size of a closet. In the old days, when the manor had a full staff, this had been where the housekeeper lived. I looked at the tray in her hands, then at Thomas, who was setting the main dining table with our good silverware, and I understood that this wasn't a suggestion, it was a test. She wanted to see if I would meekly accept being relegated to the servants' quarters in my own home. "That's very thoughtful," I said calmly, taking the tray from her hands. "I think I will have a quiet evening." I walked to the small room, closed the door behind me, and sat down to eat my dinner alone. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: absolute clarity. Tomorrow, Sophia's parents would arrive expecting to meet a confused, overwhelmed, old woman who needed to be managed and protected from herself. They would see exactly what Sophia wanted them to see: evidence that I was no longer capable of caring for myself or my property. But what they wouldn't see coming was the phone call I was about to make. I finished my dinner, set the tray aside, and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Margaret Blackwood, senior partner at Blackwood, Morrison and Associates, the law firm that had handled the Whitmore family's legal affairs for over 50 years. Margaret had been William's law school roommate and had become one of our closest friends over the decades. She was also one of the most formidable attorneys in the state of Texas, with a reputation for destroying anyone foolish enough to underestimate her simply because she was a woman. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered. "Eleanor, is everything all right? It's rather late for a social call." "Margaret," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I need to see you tomorrow morning, and I need you to bring every legal document related to my estate, my property, and my medical decision-making authority." There was a pause. "Eleanor, you're starting to worry me. Has something happened?" I looked around the tiny room where I was being encouraged to live out my remaining years, then thought about the conversation I'd overheard in the garden. "Yes," I said quietly. "Something has definitely happened. But don't worry. By tomorrow evening, it's going to be handled." Margaret's voice sharpened with interest. "What do you need me to do?" "Remind some people that Eleanor Whitmore isn't dead yet, and that trying to bury someone before they're ready for the grave can be a very dangerous mistake." After I hung up, I sat in that small room for a long time, listening to the sounds of Thomas and Sophia cleaning up the kitchen and discussing their plans for her parents' visit. Their voices carried easily through the thin walls, and I heard Sophia coaching Thomas on what to say and what details to emphasize when describing my recent behavior. But what they didn't know was that Eleanor Whitmore had just fired the opening shot in a war they weren't prepared to fight. And by the time the sun set tomorrow, they would learn that underestimating a Texas oil heiress was the biggest mistake of their lives. Margaret Blackwood arrived at precisely 9 a.m, driving her pristine black Mercedes through the circular driveway like she owned the place. At 68, she still carried herself with the commanding presence that had made her legendary in Texas courtrooms for 4 decades. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I met her at the front door before anyone else in the house was awake, carrying a thermos of coffee and my late husband's leather briefcase that I hadn't opened since his funeral. Margaret took one look at me and immediately understood that this wasn't a social visit. "Eleanor," she said, embracing me briefly, "you look like a woman with a plan." "I am," I replied, leading her toward William's old study, "and I need your help to execute it properly." We settled into the study, a room that Sophia hadn't yet claimed for herself, probably because it still smelled like William's pipe tobacco and contained too many memories for her to feel comfortable colonizing. Margaret opened her briefcase and spread documents across the mahogany desk while I poured coffee from the thermos. "Before we begin," Margaret said, "I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need honest answers. Are you experiencing any memory issues, confusion, or cognitive difficulties that might affect your judgment?" I met her eyes steadily. "My mind is as sharp as it was the day William died. What I've been experiencing is systematic manipulation designed to make me question my own competence." Margaret nodded and pulled out a small recording device. "Do you mind if I record this conversation? Given what you've told me, I suspect we may need documentation of your mental state and decision-making capacity." For the next hour, I walked Margaret through everything that had happened since Thomas and Sophia moved into the manor. I told her about the gradual exclusion from my own spaces, the patronizing comments about my age and abilities, and the constant suggestions that I needed to take things easier. I described the overheard phone conversation about guardianship and development plans and how small, normal moments were being reframed as evidence of confusion. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in her precise handwriting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the sharp-eyed intensity that had made opposing attorneys fear her for decades. "Eleanor, what you're describing is a textbook case of elder manipulation with the goal of financial exploitation. The gradual isolation, the gaslighting about your competence, the positioning of themselves as reluctant caretakers, it's all very calculated." She pulled out a thick folder and opened it on the desk. "Let's review your current legal position. First, the Whitmore Manor and all property associated with it is held entirely in your name. William's will left everything to you with full ownership and control. There are no co-owners, no joint tenancies, no legal obligations to provide housing for adult children." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "I thought so, but I haven't looked at the documents in so long." "Second," Margaret continued, "your financial assets are substantial and entirely under your control. The oil rights alone generate enough income to maintain this property indefinitely. You have no debt, no outstanding obligations, and no legal requirement to support Thomas financially." She turned to another section of documents. "Third, and this is crucial, you currently have a clean medical record with no documented cognitive issues. Your primary care physician, Dr. Rodriguez, has seen you regularly and has never noted any concerns about your mental capacity." Margaret's expression grew stern. "However, what Sophia is attempting is unfortunately common and often successful. If they can establish a pattern of documented incidents suggesting cognitive decline, they could petition for guardianship. Once that happens, you lose control over your finances, your property, and even your own medical decisions. The thought sent a chill down my spine. How do we prevent that? We get ahead of it, Margaret said with a predatory smile that reminded me why she'd never lost a case that mattered. We document your competence thoroughly and establish legal safeguards before they can move forward with their plan. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card. Dr. Sophia Chen, no relation to your daughter-in-law, is one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in the state. She specializes in competency evaluations and elder abuse cases. I want you to see her this week for a complete cognitive assessment. I took the card, noting the irony of the name. What will that accomplish? It will establish a baseline of your mental acuity from an independent medical professional. More importantly, Dr. Chen is trained to recognize the signs of psychological manipulation and elder abuse. Her evaluation will carry significant weight if this ever goes to court. Margaret pulled out another set of documents. Second, I'm going to draft what's called a Declaration of Competence and Intent. It's a legal document where you explicitly state your mental capacity, your understanding of your assets, and your intentions regarding your estate. We'll have it witnessed and notarized, creating an official record that contradicts any claims of confusion or incapacity. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone she'd used to address juries. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. What Sophia is doing isn't just morally reprehensible, it's criminal. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraudulent attempts to gain guardianship are serious felonies in Texas. We have enough evidence right now to involve law enforcement. I considered this, thinking about Thomas and how he'd been drawn into Sophia's web of manipulation. I don't want to destroy my son's life, but I also won't let them succeed in destroying mine. We don't have to choose between those options, Margaret said. There's a third path. We can stop the abuse, protect your assets, and give Thomas an opportunity to remove himself from this situation before it becomes a criminal matter. She began gathering the documents. Here's what I propose. We get the competency evaluation, done immediately. We establish the legal documentation of your mental state. Then we give them exactly what they think they want, but on your terms, not theirs. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Margaret's smile turned downright dangerous. Sophia's parents are arriving tonight expecting to meet a confused, overwhelmed old woman who needs to be saved from herself. Instead, they're going to meet Eleanor Whitmore, competent property owner and successful businesswoman, who has some very interesting questions about their daughter's behavior. She stood and began packing her briefcase. I'll call Dr. Chen and get you an emergency appointment for this afternoon. Can you get away from the house without arousing suspicion? I'll tell them I'm going to the grocery store, I said. It fits with their narrative that I'm trying to maintain independence despite my supposed confusion. Perfect. After the evaluation, we'll return here together. I think it's time Sophia's parents understood exactly what kind of situation they're walking into. Margaret paused at the door. Eleanor, are you prepared for this to get ugly? Once we start pushing back, they're going to escalate their behavior. Sophia is going to become more desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I thought about the tiny room where I'd eaten dinner the night before, about the phone conversation I'd overheard, about the way my own son had started looking at me like I was a burden to be managed. Margaret, it's already ugly. I'm just tired of being the only one pretending it isn't. After Margaret left, I spent the morning moving through the house with new eyes, noticing details I'd been too hurt and confused to see clearly before. In the master bedroom that had been mine and William's for 3 decades, I found that Sophia had moved her cosmetics onto my vanity table and hung her clothes in my closet. Thomas's belongings occupied William's side of the room. while my own possessions had been gradually shifted to smaller and smaller spaces. In the kitchen, I discovered that Sophia had rearranged the cabinets, moving my grandmother's china to a high shelf that I would need a step stool to reach. The everyday dishes were now stored in the cabinets that had always held my baking supplies, forcing me to search for basic items in my own kitchen. Even the family photographs had been subtly altered. Pictures of William and me had been moved to less prominent locations, while newer photos of Thomas and Sophia occupied the prime spots on mantels and side tables. It was as if my history in this house was being gradually erased, one small change at a time. But the most telling discovery came when I went to William's study to retrieve some papers. Hidden behind a row of law books, I found a manila folder that didn't belong there. Inside were printed emails between Sophia and someone named Marcus Rivera, who appeared to be a real estate developer. The emails dated back 6 months, beginning just after Thomas and Sophia had moved into the manor. In them, Sophia described the property in detail, including square footage, acreage, and potential development opportunities. Marcus responded with preliminary assessments of the land's value and suggestions for maximizing profit through subdivision and commercial development. One email from Sophia particularly caught my attention. The old woman is more stubborn than we anticipated, but Thomas is finally starting to see reason. She had another episode yesterday where she couldn't find her reading glasses and accused me of moving them. It's getting easier to document these incidents. My father thinks we should accelerate the timeline. Another response from Marcus. If you can get the guardianship established by spring, we can have the property rezoned and on the market by fall. The location is perfect for a luxury shopping complex. Conservative estimate puts the development value at $15 million, maybe $20 million if we can get the zoning variances approved. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands trembling with rage as I realized the full scope of their planning. This wasn't just about taking control of my life. It was about destroying 4 generations of family history for a shopping mall. At 11 o'clock, I announced to Thomas and Sophia that I was driving into town to pick up groceries for their parents' visit. Sophia immediately offered to come with me, claiming she wanted to make sure I got everything on her list, but I politely declined. I think I can manage a trip to the grocery store, I said with just enough edge in my voice to make her pause. Thomas looked up from his laptop. Mom, maybe Sophia should go with you. You know how you get overwhelmed in crowded places lately. It was the first time he'd openly suggested that I couldn't handle a simple errand, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Thomas, I've been shopping at Mitchell's Market for 30 years. I think I can find my way around. I drove to town in my old Cadillac, the same car William had bought me for our 40th anniversary. The familiar weight of the steering wheel and the smooth purr of the engine helped calm my nerves as I processed everything I'd learned that morning. Dr. Chen's office was located in a modern medical building near the hospital. Her waiting room was designed to be calming, with soft music and comfortable chairs, but I was too agitated to relax. When she called me back to her office, I was struck by how young she looked, probably not much older than Sophia, with an open, intelligent face and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, settling behind her desk. Margaret Blackwood explained the situation briefly, but I'd like to hear the details from you. What's been happening that concerns you? For the next 2 hours, Dr. Chen put me through the most comprehensive mental evaluation I'd ever experienced. She tested my memory, my reasoning ability, my capacity to make complex decisions, and my understanding of abstract concepts. She asked detailed questions about my daily routines, my relationships, and my emotional state. Midway through the evaluation, she stopped and looked at me directly. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you about some specific behaviors that are commonly seen in elder abuse situations. Have you noticed anyone attempting to isolate you from friends or family members? I thought about how Sophia had gradually discouraged my involvement in planning social events at the house, claiming she wanted to spare me the stress. Yes, but it was presented as being helpful. Have you experienced anyone questioning your memory or competence about things you're certain you remember correctly? I described the incidents with the stove and the car keys, and several other small moments that had been reframed as evidence of confusion. Dr. Chen made notes throughout my responses. Have you been discouraged from driving, managing your own finances, or making decisions about your living situation? The questions continued for another hour, each one illuminating another aspect of the manipulation I'd been experiencing. By the end of the session, Dr. Chen had compiled a comprehensive picture of both my mental state and the circumstances I was dealing with. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said finally, "I want to be very clear about my findings. You are cognitively intact, mentally competent, and fully capable of making your own decisions about your life and your property. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning skills are sharp, and your judgment is sound." Relief flooded through me. So there's nothing wrong with my mind? Nothing at all. What you've been experiencing is a form of psychological manipulation called gaslighting, combined with what appears to be systematic elder abuse designed to undermine your confidence and independence. It's unfortunately common, and it's particularly insidious because it makes victims question their own perceptions. Dr. Chen handed me a thick envelope. "This contains my complete evaluation, including cognitive test results, my professional assessment of your mental capacity, and my observations regarding the psychological manipulation you've described. Margaret has asked me to provide expert testimony if needed." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand that what's happening to you isn't normal family dynamics or generational conflict. It's abuse, and it's designed to strip you of your autonomy and your assets. The fact that you recognized it and sought help demonstrates considerable strength and clarity of thought." I drove home with Dr. Chen's evaluation on the passenger seat beside me, feeling like I was armed with the most powerful weapon imaginable: the truth, professionally documented and legally valid. When I arrived back at the manor, I found Sophia in the kitchen arranging flowers in my grandmother's crystal vase. She looked up with her usual practiced smile, but I caught a flicker of something else in her eyes, maybe suspicion, maybe concern. "How was your shopping trip?" she asked, her tone carefully casual. "Very productive," I replied, deliberately not elaborating. Thomas emerged from the study carrying a stack of papers. "Mom, Sophia, and I have been talking, and we think it might be a good idea to have someone come in to help you with the house cleaning and daily tasks, just temporarily, while you adjust to having us here." I set my purse down carefully and looked at both of them. "What kind of help are you thinking about?" Sophia jumped in before Thomas could respond. "Just someone to handle the heavier cleaning, maybe help with meal preparation. I know a service that specializes in working with senior citizens. They're very discreet and respectful." The phrase "specializes in working with senior citizens" sent warning bells clanging in my head. This was another step in their plan to position me as someone who needed assistance with basic living tasks. "That's very thoughtful," I said evenly, "but I think I'm managing quite well on my own." Thomas frowned. "Mom, you've been struggling. More than you want to admit. Yesterday you seemed confused about where you'd put your gardening gloves, and this morning you couldn't remember whether you'd taken your vitamins." Both statements were lies. I'd put my gardening gloves exactly where I always put them, in the mudroom closet, but they'd been moved to a basket in the garage. And I'd never said anything about forgetting my vitamins. That conversation had never happened. But I realized they were creating a false narrative in real time, building the foundation for their claims about my declining mental state. Soon, these fictional incidents would become established facts in their minds, and probably in their documentation. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "But I'm not ready for outside help just yet." Sophia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Eleanor. We just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed. Managing a property this size is a huge responsibility, even for someone much younger. The implication was clear. At my age, I was no longer capable of handling my own home. "When do your parents arrive?" I asked, changing the subject. "Their flight lands at 4:30, Sophia replied. "I thought we'd have a quiet dinner here tonight. Just family. Nothing too elaborate." I nodded. "That sounds lovely. I'll make sure everything is ready." "Oh, you don't need to worry about anything," Sophia said quickly. "I've already planned the menu and arranged for everything. Why don't you just rest this afternoon? You've had such a busy morning with your errands." There it was again, the gentle but firm suggestion that I should step back and let others handle things. But this time, instead of feeling hurt and confused, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. "Actually," I said, "I think I'll spend some time in William's study this afternoon. I have some papers to review." I saw Thomas and Sophia exchange a quick glance, and I knew they were wondering what papers I might be looking at. Let them wonder. By evening, they would have much bigger concerns. At 3:00, Margaret returned as planned, bringing with her a notary public and another woman I didn't recognize. A stern-looking individual in her 50s who carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Eleanor," Margaret said, "I'd like you to meet Detective Linda Morrison from the Elder Crimes Unit. Given what we've discussed, I thought it would be wise to have law enforcement aware of the situation." Detective Morrison shook my hand with a firm grip. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed the information Margaret provided, and I'd like to ask you some questions about your living situation. Would that be all right?" We settled in William's study, and I found myself describing the past several months from yet another perspective, this time as potential criminal activity rather than family conflict. Detective Morrison listened with the practiced attention of someone who'd heard similar stories before. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said when I finished, "what you're describing fits the pattern of organized elder fraud. The gradual isolation, the false documentation of incompetence, the financial planning without your knowledge. It suggests coordination between multiple parties." She pulled out a small notebook. "I'd like to document this officially and establish a timeline of events. If charges become necessary, we'll have a foundation already in place." For the next hour, we worked through every incident I could remember, from the small slights and suggestions to the overheard phone conversations and hidden emails. Margaret notarized my competency declaration, and Detective Morrison took my official statement regarding the suspected fraud. At 4:45, we heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Sophia's parents had arrived. Margaret looked at me with anticipation. "Are you ready for this, Eleanor?" I thought about the tiny room where I'd been encouraged to take my meals, about the phone conversation planning my financial destruction, about my son who'd forgotten that his mother was a human being worthy of respect. "I've been ready my whole life," I said. "I just didn't know it until now." We heard voices in the front hall, Sophia's bright laughter mingling with unfamiliar tones as she greeted her parents. Thomas's voice joined the conversation, and I could hear him playing the role of the concerned son, probably already beginning to set the stage for their planned intervention. Margaret packed up her papers. "Remember, let them show their hand. First, don't reveal what you know until they've committed to their narrative." Detective Morrison handed me her card. "If anything escalates beyond what we've discussed, call me immediately. And Mrs. Whitmore? Trust your instincts. They've served you well so far." After they left through the back door, I took a few moments alone in William's study to center myself. I looked at his portrait hanging above the fireplace, remembering the man who'd built this life with me, who'd trusted me to preserve our legacy. "Don't worry, sweetheart," I whispered to the photograph. "I've got this handled." Then I walked toward the front of the house to meet the people who thought they were coming to evaluate a confused old woman's fitness for independence. Instead, they were about to encounter Eleanor Whitmore at her most formidable, armed with truth, backed by law, and ready for war. I walked into the front parlor to find Sophia embracing an elegant woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and expensive jewelry. The man standing beside her looked like he'd stepped out of a tech conference, crisp khakis, button-down shirt, and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of corporate success. "Eleanor?" Sophia exclaimed with theatrical warmth. "I'd like you to meet my parents, David and Helen Chen." Helen approached me with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to making good impressions. "Eleanor, it's such a pleasure to finally meet you. Sophia has told us so much about you and this magnificent home." David extended his hand with a firm businessman's grip. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for having us. This place is absolutely stunning, like something out of a historical magazine." I accepted their greetings with polite warmth, studying their faces as they took in the grandeur of the manor's main hall. Helen's eyes were calculating as they swept over the antique furnishings and original oil paintings, while David seemed to be mentally cataloging architectural details. "Please, call me Eleanor," I said, leading them toward the sitting room. "I hope your flight from San Francisco was comfortable." "Oh, it was lovely," Helen replied, settling into one of the Queen Anne chairs that had belonged to my grandmother. "Though I have to say, we're both eager to see more of the property." Sophia's descriptions made it sound like a real treasure. Thomas appeared in the doorway, looking nervous and fidgety. "Mom, can I get anyone drinks? Coffee, wine, something stronger?" "Wine sounds perfect," David said. "I understand you have quite an impressive wine cellar here." "William collected wines for 40 years, I replied. "He always said a good cellar was like a good marriage. It only improved with time and patience." Sophia laughed a little too brightly. "Eleanor loves to tell stories about the old days. She has such wonderful memories of when she was more involved in managing everything." The phrasing was deliberate and cutting. Not when she managed everything, but when she was more involved in managing everything, as if my role had always been peripheral and had naturally diminished over time. Helen picked up on the cue immediately. "It must be such a relief to have Thomas and Sophia here to help you now. These large properties can become so overwhelming as we get older." I smiled serenely. "Actually, I find the work quite fulfilling. Just this morning I was reviewing some property assessments and investment portfolios. It's amazing how much the land values have increased over the past few years." David's attention sharpened noticeably. "Oh? Are you considering any development? Opportunities? Development?" I looked genuinely puzzled. "Oh my, no. This land has been in our family for over a century. William always said it was a sacred trust. Something to preserve, not exploit." I watched Sophia's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This wasn't going according to whatever script she'd prepared her parents to expect. Thomas returned with wine glasses and began pouring from a bottle of William's best Bordeaux. As he handed drinks around, Sophia moved to stand beside him in a subtle show of unity. "Eleanor," Sophia said carefully, "maybe we should tell your parents about some of the challenges we've been discussing. You know, the maintenance issues and the questions about long-term sustainability." Helen leaned forward with practiced concern. "Oh dear, what kind of challenges?" "Well," Thomas began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd come to dread, "Mom's been having some difficulty keeping track of things lately. Little things, but they add up. Yesterday she spent 20 minutes looking for her reading glasses, when they were on her head the whole time." This was a complete fabrication. I'd been reading in the garden and had pushed my glasses up when Sophia interrupted me to ask about dinner plans. But I said nothing, curious to see how elaborate their fictional narrative would become. David nodded sympathetically. "That kind of thing is perfectly normal at your age, Eleanor. Nothing to be embarrassed about." "And the house is just so much work," Sophia added, warming to her theme. The cleaning, the maintenance, keeping track of all the bills and paperwork. We've been trying to convince Eleanor to let us help more, but she's very independent. The word independent was spoken like a character flaw that needed to be corrected. Helen set down her wine glass. You know, Eleanor, David and I went through something very similar with my mother a few years ago. She was living in the family home in Marin County, insisting she could manage everything herself, but we could see she was struggling. What did you do? Thomas asked, right on cue. We had to make some difficult decisions for her own safety and peace of mind, David replied. Moving her to a lovely assisted living community was actually the best thing we could have done. She's much happier now, with no responsibilities to worry about. The conversation was proceeding exactly as I'd expected, but I found myself fascinated by how smoothly they all played their roles. Thomas, the concerned son, Sophia, the dutiful daughter-in-law, and her parents, the wise advisors who'd successfully navigated similar family challenges. That must have been a difficult transition, I said mildly. Helen nodded gravely. It was, but sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is take the burden of decision-making away from them. My mother fought us at first, but within 6 months, she was thanking us. The property sale actually worked out beautifully, David added. We were able to get top dollar because the Bay Area market was so hot, and the proceeds ensured that Mother would be comfortable for the rest of her life. There it was, the template they wanted me to follow. Grateful acceptance of diminished autonomy in exchange for financial security and freedom from responsibility. Sophia moved closer to her father. Daddy, maybe you could tell Eleanor about those lovely communities you researched in Austin. The ones with the full-service amenities and medical support. I nearly laughed at how transparent they were being. Had they really thought I was so confused that I wouldn't recognize a coordinated sales pitch when I heard one? Oh, there are some wonderful options, David said enthusiastically. Luxury retirement communities that feel more like resort hotels than care facilities. Full dining services, housekeeping, activities programs, transportation to shopping and medical appointments. Everything handled so you never have to worry about anything again. It sounds very comprehensive, I said, taking a delicate sip of wine. Thomas leaned forward eagerly. Mom, maybe we should at least look at some brochures, just to get an idea of what's available. I already have some materials in the car, Helen said, reaching for her purse. Would you like me to get them? That's very thoughtful, I replied. But I should mention that I had some visitors earlier today who might be interested in this conversation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sophia's smile faltered for just a moment, before she recovered. Visitors? She asked casually. Yes, my attorney Margaret Blackwood stopped by this morning. Such a sharp woman. She's been handling our family's legal affairs for decades. And Detective Morrison from the county sheriff's office. Lovely lady. Very professional. Thomas paled visibly. Detective? Mom, why was there a detective here? I set down my wine glass and looked around the room at their suddenly tense faces. Oh, just some routine questions about elder fraud cases in the area. Apparently, there's been an uptick in schemes targeting older property owners. She wanted to make sure I was aware of the warning signs. David cleared his throat nervously. What kind of warning signs? Well, let's see, I said, as if recalling a casual conversation. Attempts to isolate elderly people from their normal social activities. Questions about their mental competence designed to undermine their confidence. Gradual assumption of decision-making authority without proper legal documentation. Unauthorized discussions about selling or developing property that doesn't belong to the people having those discussions. The silence that followed was deafening. Helen's wine glass trembled slightly in her hands, and David's corporate composure was showing visible cracks. Sophia rallied first, her voice tight but controlled. Eleanor, that sounds terrifying. I hope you assured them that nothing like that was happening here. Actually, I said pleasantly, I told them I'd keep my eyes open and report anything suspicious I might observe. I stood up gracefully, smoothing my skirt. Speaking of which, I should probably mention that I found some interesting documents in William's study earlier today. Emails, actually, between Sophia and a real estate developer named Marcus Rivera. Fascinating correspondence about development potential and property values. Sophia's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, I said, my voice still calm and conversational. Especially the emails discussing guardianship timelines and zoning variances for commercial development. Marcus seems quite optimistic about turning our family heritage into a shopping complex. Thomas looked like he'd been slapped. Sophia, what is she talking about? I can show you, I offered helpfully. I photographed all of them this morning. Detective Morrison found them quite illuminating. David stood abruptly, his businessman's instincts finally kicking in. I think there may be some misunderstanding here. Perhaps we should— Oh, there's no misunderstanding, I interrupted, my tone finally hardening. I understand perfectly. You came here expecting to meet a confused, lonely old woman who could be convinced to sign away her independence and her property for the promise of safety and simplicity. I moved to stand in front of the fireplace, positioning myself where the portrait of William looked down over my shoulder. Instead, you're meeting Eleanor Whitmore, who spent this morning with a geriatric psychiatrist getting a comprehensive competency evaluation. Perfect mental health, by the way. Cognitively intact, emotionally stable, and fully capable of making my own decisions about my life and my property. Helen's composure finally cracked. Eleanor, I think you may be misinterpreting— Am I misinterpreting the phone conversation I overheard 2 days ago where your daughter discussed establishing my diminished capacity for guardianship purposes? Am I misinterpreting the emails about development profits and property rezoning? Am I misinterpreting the systematic isolation from my own living spaces and the constant suggestions that I'm too confused to manage my own affairs? The room was dead silent except for the ticking of the antique mantel clock that had belonged to my great-grandmother. You see, I continued, what you've all forgotten is that confused old ladies don't usually have close relationships with senior partners. At prestigious law firms, confused old ladies don't typically maintain detailed financial records and property assessments. And confused old ladies certainly don't recognize elder fraud when it's being perpetrated against them. Thomas finally found his voice. Mom, I never meant for— Thomas, I said sharply. You forfeited the right to explain your intentions when you started lying about my mental state to build a case for taking away my autonomy. I moved to the side table where Sophia had placed her purse and pulled out my phone. I have Margaret on speed dial, and Detective Morrison asked me to contact her immediately if there were any attempts to pressure me into financial or living arrangements against my will. David held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Mrs. Whitmore, I think we should all take a step back and discuss this calmly. By all means, I agreed. Let's discuss it. Let's discuss how you raised a daughter who thinks elder abuse is an acceptable way to acquire real estate. Let's discuss how you flew here planning to help convince a supposedly incompetent woman to abandon her family home. Let's discuss how you researched assisted living facilities before you'd even met me. Sophia finally exploded. You don't understand. This house is falling apart. The maintenance costs are insane. You're sitting on millions of dollars of property value while complaining about being lonely and overwhelmed. There it is, I said with satisfaction. The truth at last. Not concern for my welfare, but frustration that I'm not maximizing the economic potential of assets that don't belong to you. Thomas stood up shakily. Sophia, what have you done? What I've done, she snapped, turning on him. What we've done. You're the one who's been documenting her confusion and forgetfulness. You're the one who agreed that she needed intervention. Don't act like you're innocent in this. Helen looked horrified. Sophia, stop talking, right now. But Sophia was beyond caring about strategy or discretion. I'm tired of pretending this is about her best interests. She's wasting resources that could provide financial security for decades. That property could be developed into something that benefits the entire community instead of just housing one stubborn old woman's memories. Whose property? I asked quietly. What? Whose property could be developed? Because last time I checked, my name is the only one on the deed, the tax assessments, and every legal document associated with this estate. David tried once more to salvage the situation. Mrs. Whitmore, surely we can work out some arrangement that benefits everyone. Mr. Chen, I interrupted, are you seriously suggesting that I should negotiate with people who attempted to defraud me out of my home and my independence? I walked to the front window and looked out at the circular driveway where their rental car was parked next to my Cadillac. I think it's time for you to leave. All of you. Sophia's voice turned vicious. You can't throw us out. We live here. When I return, I expect this house to be exactly as I left it, with nothing missing and nothing damaged. Sophia's mask finally slipped completely. You bitter old witch. You'd rather destroy everything than share it with your own son. I'm not destroying anything, I said calmly. I'm protecting it from people who would destroy it for profit. There's a difference, though I wouldn't expect you to understand it. I walked toward the door, then turned back for one final statement. Thomas, when you're ready to apologize, really apologize. Not just express regret for getting caught. Margaret has my contact information. But understand that some betrayals cut too deep for simple forgiveness. You'll have to earn your way back into my life, and that process begins with removing the person who poisoned your judgment against your own mother. As I reached the front door, I heard Sophia shriek behind me. You can't do this to us. We gave up everything to be here. I paused without turning around. No, Sophia. You gambled everything on a scheme to defraud an elderly woman, and you lost. The house always wins eventually, and in this case, I am the house. I walked out into the evening air, breathing deeply of the familiar scents of jasmine and oak that had perfumed my family's land for generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Thomas and Sophia realized the full scope of their legal jeopardy. But tonight, I felt like myself again for the first time in months. Eleanor Whitmore was back, and she wasn't going anywhere. Margaret's guest house was a charming stone cottage nestled among the live oaks on her property, complete with a fireplace, a well-stocked kitchen, and windows that looked out over rolling hills dotted with wildflowers. It had been her retreat for years, the place she went when she needed to think through complex cases or simply escape from the demands of her practice. Now it had become my sanctuary while the legal machinery ground into motion. I'd been there for 3 days when Margaret knocked on the door early Tuesday morning, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a thick folder that I'd learned to associate with either very good news or very bad complications. They're not going quietly, she announced, settling into the chair across from my small breakfast table. Thomas hired Bradley Morrison from Morrison Webb & Associates yesterday afternoon. I recognized the name. Bradley Morrison was detective, Morrison's younger brother, and one of Austin's more aggressive defense attorneys. Family loyalty or professional reputation? Both, probably. Linda warned me that Bradley doesn't like to lose, especially cases that might reflect badly on the family name. He's already filed a motion challenging the eviction and requesting a competency hearing. The news didn't surprise me, but it still sent a chill down my spine. On what grounds? Margaret opened her folder and pulled out a legal document. He's claiming that my longtime relationship with you creates a conflict of interest, and that your recent legal actions demonstrate erratic behavior consistent with diminished capacity. He's also arguing that Thomas has established residency rights through extended cohabitation and financial contribution to household expenses. I laughed despite myself. Financial contributions? Thomas hasn't paid for so much as a grocery bill since he moved in. That's what we need to prove, Margaret said seriously. Bradley's good at what he does, and he's going to paint a picture of a devoted son who's been supporting his aging mother both emotionally and financially, only to be suddenly and irrationally cast out because of manipulative outside influences. She handed me another document. This is his client list for the past 5 years. 3 successful guardianship cases, all involving elderly clients with substantial assets. He knows exactly how to play this game. I studied the papers, feeling the weight of what was ahead. What does Linda think about her brother representing them? She's professionally furious, Margaret replied with a grim smile. Bradley called her yesterday to fish for information about the criminal investigation. When she told him to mind his own business, he suggested that she might be compromising her objectivity because of our friendship. Are there conflict of interest issues we need to worry about? Not for Linda. Elder abuse cases take precedence over family politics, and she's documented everything properly. But Bradley's going to use the family connection to suggest that this whole situation is the result of professional networking rather than legitimate concerns. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a text message. This came in at 6 this morning. Bradley wants to meet this afternoon to discuss a potential settlement. I read the message twice. What kind of settlement? The kind where you voluntarily transfer property management authority to Thomas in exchange for him dropping the competency challenge and agreeing to shared residency arrangements. You'd maintain ownership, but surrender operational control. The suggestion made my stomach turn. So I'd become a tenant in my own home, dependent on Thomas's goodwill for every decision about my life and property. That's exactly what it would amount to, Margaret confirmed. But here's the interesting part. Bradley sent this proposal without consulting Sophia. According to my sources, she's furious that Thomas hired an attorney without discussing strategy with her first. I considered this development. They're starting to turn on each other. It gets better, Margaret said, pulling out another document. Detective Morrison executed a search warrant on Sophia's electronics yesterday evening. Her email correspondence with Marcus Rivera is more extensive than we initially thought, and there are also communications with a financial planner about asset liquidation strategies. She handed me printed copies of several emails. These are from 2 weeks ago, right? Around the time they were pressuring you to eat in the servants' quarters, Sophia was already getting quotes for property appraisal and discussing optimal timing for a forced sale. Reading the emails felt like watching a chess game where I'd been unaware that I was even a player. Sophia had been methodically planning the dismantling of my life while I was grieving the loss of my husband and trying to adjust to sharing my home. There's something else, Margaret said quietly. The financial planner she was consulting specializes in what they call elder transition services. They help families navigate the legal and financial aspects of moving elderly relatives into managed care while maximizing asset recovery. I set down the emails, feeling sick. How many other families has she done this to? According to Detective Morrison, Sophia's been building expertise in this area for about 2 years. We have rights. Actually, you don't, I said, turning back to face her. You have no legal rights to this property, no claim to residence here, and no authority to make decisions about its future. What you have is 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements. Thomas looked stunned. Mom, you can't be serious. Thomas, I gave you life, love, education, and opportunity. I supported your dreams, celebrated your successes, and comforted you through your failures. But I never gave you permission to treat me like an obstacle to your financial ambitions. I moved to the antique secretary desk in the corner and pulled out a manila envelope that Margaret had prepared. These are formal notices to vacate the property. Margaret filed them with the county this afternoon. Sophia grabbed the envelope and tore it open, her hands shaking as she read the legal documents. This is insane. You're destroying your own family over money. No, I said firmly. You destroyed this family when you decided my love and hospitality were weaknesses to be exploited rather than gifts to be treasured. David was pulling out his phone. I'm calling our attorney. Please do, I encouraged. I'm sure Margaret would enjoy explaining Texas elder abuse statutes to him. Did you know that financial exploitation of an elderly person is a second-degree felony that can result in 20 years in prison? Helen stood up abruptly. David, we're leaving. Now. You can't just abandon us here, Sophia protested to her parents. Watch us, David replied grimly. We came here to help with what we thought was a family care situation. We're not staying. To participate in whatever this has become. As Helen gathered her purse, she looked at me with something that might have been respect. Mrs. Whitmore, I apologize. We were clearly misinformed about the circumstances here. Yes, you were, I agreed. Though I suspect you were misinformed quite deliberately. After Sophia's parents left, the three of us stood in the parlor amid the wreckage of their carefully orchestrated intervention. Thomas slumped into his father's old chair, his head in his hands. Sophia paced back and forth like a caged animal, clutching the eviction papers. This is all your fault, she hissed at Thomas. You said she was becoming more compliant, that she was ready to listen to reason. I thought she was, Thomas said miserably. She seemed so lost after Dad died, so willing to let us help with things. Grief and willingness to accept help are not the same as incompetence, I said quietly. But you were so eager to believe I was failing that you didn't notice I was just mourning. Sophia whirled to face me. You've been planning this, haven't you? All that passive, confused old lady act while you were building your case against us. I wasn't acting, I replied. I was genuinely hurt and confused about why my own family was treating me like a burden. It took me time to understand that the problem wasn't my competence. It was your greed. Thomas looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. Sophia said, Thomas, I don't want to hear what Sophia said. I want to know what you thought. When did you decide that your mother was too incompetent to manage her own life? When did you conclude that my 47 years of successful marriage and motherhood had prepared me for nothing more than managed care? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. We both knew there was no good answer to that question. Sophia stopped pacing and turned to me with cold calculation in her eyes. You think you've won, but this isn't over. We'll fight the eviction. We'll contest your competency. We'll make your life hell until you give us what we want. I walked to the fireplace and picked up a thick folder from the mantel. You mean this competency evaluation from Dr. Sophia Chen, one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in Texas, the one that declares me mentally sound and documents the psychological manipulation I've been subjected to. I opened the folder and pulled out another document. Or perhaps you mean this signed statement from Detective Morrison establishing the timeline of suspected elder abuse and financial fraud. Sophia's bravado wavered as I continued pulling papers from the folder. Or maybe you're referring to these copies of your emails with Marcus Rivera, discussing property development without my knowledge or consent? I set the last document on the coffee table between us. This is my updated will, drafted this afternoon and properly witnessed. It establishes a charitable trust that will preserve this property as a historical site in perpetuity. No development, no subdivision, no shopping malls, just the Whitmore family legacy, protected forever. Thomas stared at the papers in shock. Mom, what about my inheritance? Your inheritance was supposed to be the values your father and I taught you. Integrity, loyalty, respect for family and tradition. You traded that inheritance for 30 pieces of silver and a woman who saw your mother as an obstacle to overcome, rather than a person to cherish. I gathered the papers back into the folder. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. During that time, I'll be staying with Margaret while she handles the legal aspects of this situation. Her social media shows connections with several elder care attorneys and asset management consultants. This wasn't an impulsive scheme, it was a career plan. The realization that I'd been targeted by someone who made a living out of exploiting vulnerable elderly people hit me like a physical blow. I'd thought this was about greed and opportunism, but it was actually about predatory expertise. Margaret, I want to know everything. Not just about what she planned to do to me, but about what she's already done to other people. Linda's working on that. Apparently, Sophia's previous relationships show a pattern of targeting men with elderly parents and substantial family assets. She was married briefly in California to a man whose mother owned property in Marin County, the same situation her father described at dinner. Margaret's expression grew darker. That marriage ended when the mother died unexpectedly during the guardianship proceedings. Sophia inherited nothing because the mother had time to change her will, but the experience apparently taught her to refine her approach. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She's done this before. We think so. Linda's coordinating with law enforcement in California and 2 other states where Sophia has lived. If we can establish a pattern of elder fraud, it changes this from a family dispute to a federal criminal matter. The cottage suddenly felt too small to contain my anger. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Margaret's peaceful garden while processing the magnitude of what I'd unknowingly invited into my home. How did I miss it? I asked finally. How did I not see that Thomas was dating a professional predator? Margaret joined me at the window. Because she's exceptionally good at what she does, and because you were grieving. Predators like Sophia are skilled at identifying vulnerability and exploiting it. The timing of her relationship with Thomas wasn't coincidental. She pulled out her phone and showed me a social media profile. Look at this. 3 months before she met Thomas, Sophia liked and commented on several posts about William's death from mutual friends. She was researching your family before she ever walked into Thomas's life. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. I'd welcomed a calculating predator into my home, thinking she was just a young woman who made my son happy. Instead, she'd been planning my destruction from the moment she learned I existed. What happens now? I asked. Now we go on the offensive, Margaret said with the kind of smile that had made her legendary in Texas courtrooms. Bradley Morrison thinks he's dealing with a garden-variety family inheritance dispute. He has no idea he's stumbled into the middle of a federal elder fraud investigation. She gathered up the papers and stood to leave. I'm meeting with Bradley this afternoon, but not to discuss settlements. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Thomas cooperates fully with the criminal investigation and testifies against Sophia, or he goes down with her as a co-conspirator. And if he refuses, then he learns that loyalty to a predator is a luxury he can't afford. The evidence against Sophia is overwhelming, and Thomas's participation is well documented. His only hope of avoiding prison time is to distance himself from her as quickly and completely as possible. After Margaret left, I spent the morning walking through her garden, trying to process everything I'd learned. The woman I'd welcomed as a daughter-in-law was actually a professional criminal who specialized in destroying elderly people's lives. My son, whether through weakness or willing participation, had become her accomplice in targeting his own mother. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my anger was transforming into something more powerful: determination. Sophia hadn't just attacked me, she'd attacked everything my family represented. She'd tried to turn our legacy into her profit margin, and she'd manipulated my son into betraying the values his father and I had spent 35 years teaching him. Around noon, Detective Morrison called to update me on the criminal investigation. Eleanor, I wanted you to know that we've executed search warrants on both Thomas's and Sophia's electronics. The evidence we're finding exceeds our initial expectations. What kind of evidence? Communications with at least 6 other individuals who appear to be part of a larger network. Sophia wasn't working alone. She's connected to attorneys, financial advisors, and healthcare consultants who specialize in what they call estate acceleration services. The phrase made my skin crawl. How many other families have they targeted? We're still piecing that together, but it looks like they've been operating in Texas, California, and Florida for at least 3 years. The conservative estimate is that they've defrauded elderly victims out of more than $12 million in property and assets. I sat down hard on Margaret's garden bench. $12 million. Eleanor, you need to understand that stopping this scheme is about more than protecting your own interests. You may have saved dozens of other families from experiencing what you've been through. What about Thomas? What's his level of involvement? Detective Morrison paused before answering. That's complicated. The evidence suggests that Sophia recruited him specifically because of your family's assets, but his communications showed genuine confusion about some of her activities. He may have been a victim of manipulation himself, at least initially. But not lately? No. The recent emails show that he was fully aware of the guardianship plan and the property development scheme. He may have started as a victim, but he became a willing participant. After hanging up, I realized that I needed to make some decisions about how far I was willing to take this fight. I could accept a settlement that would get Thomas and Sophia out of my house while allowing them to escape serious consequences. Or I could see the criminal case through to its conclusion, knowing that it might send my own son to prison. That evening, Margaret returned from her meeting with Bradley Morrison looking both satisfied and concerned. "How did it go?" I asked. "Exactly as I expected." Bradley came in thinking he was negotiating from a position of strength and left realizing that his client is about to become the focus of a multi-state criminal investigation. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled into her favorite chair. I laid out everything: the elder fraud network, the federal interest, the pattern of previous victims. Bradley's not stupid. He understood immediately that Thomas's best option is cooperation. What was his response? Professional shock, followed by rapid calculation. He asked for 24 hours to consult with his client about a cooperation agreement. Margaret's expression grew more serious. But there's a complication. Sophia's retained new counsel, Rebecca Walsh from Dallas. Walsh specializes in defending white-collar criminals, and she's very good at what she does. I recognized that name, too. Rebecca Walsh had been in the news recently for successfully defending a prominent businessman accused of securities fraud. What does that mean for us? It means Sophia's not planning to go quietly. Walsh doesn't take cases, she doesn't think she can win, and her presence suggests that Sophia has resources we haven't accounted for yet. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a news article. This is from yesterday's Dallas Morning News. Walsh gave an interview about elder abuse cases, claiming that many are actually family disputes being criminalized by opportunistic prosecutors and manipulative attorneys. Reading the article made my blood pressure spike. Walsh was essentially arguing that elderly people who accused their families of abuse were often confused or vindictive, and that the real victims were adult children, being punished for trying to help their aging parents. She's going to use my competency as her primary defense strategy, I realized. That's exactly right. Walsh will argue that this entire case is the result of my manipulation of a grieving, possibly confused elderly woman who was encouraged to view normal family dynamics as criminal behavior. The implications were staggering. If Walsh succeeded in undermining my credibility, it wouldn't just affect the criminal case against Sophia. It would validate everything they'd tried to do to me in the first place. Margaret, I need to ask you something honestly. Is there any possibility that I've misunderstood what happened? Could this really be a family conflict that got out of hand rather than a criminal conspiracy? Margaret looked at me seriously. Eleanor, do you remember the specific words Sophia used in that phone conversation you overheard? I closed my eyes and recalled the moment by the fountain. She said the property was worth at least $4 million. that Thomas was completely on board, and that I was showing signs of confusion. She mentioned getting guardianship within 6 months. Do you remember her exact words about the lawyer's advice? She said their lawyer told them if they could establish a pattern of diminished capacity, they could probably get guardianship within 6 months. Margaret nodded. Those aren't the words of someone trying to help a confused relative. Those are the words of someone executing a premeditated plan to seize control of another person's assets through legal manipulation. She pulled out the folder of emails again. And these communications with Marcus Rivera about development potential, they date back 6 months to just after William's funeral. Sophia was planning to develop your property before she ever moved into your house. I thought about Thomas and the man I'd raised him to be. What about my son? Is it possible he didn't understand what he was participating in? Initially, maybe. But Eleanor, look at this. Margaret showed me a printed email from Thomas to Sophia dated just 2 weeks earlier. He's discussing which of your behaviors to document and suggesting that your resistance to giving up driving privileges could be framed as dangerous impulsivity. Reading my own son's words about manipulating my behavior for legal purposes felt like being stabbed in the heart. Thomas hadn't been a passive victim of Sophia's manipulation. He'd been an active participant in building a case against my competency. I need some air, I said, walking out to Margaret's patio. The evening was warm and peaceful, with the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. I thought about William and what he would have done in this situation. He'd always believed in justice, but he'd also believed in family loyalty and the possibility of redemption. But he'd also taught me that some betrayals were so fundamental that they destroyed the relationships they violated. Trust is like virginity, he used to say. Once it's gone, you can't get it back. When Margaret joined me on the patio, I was ready with my decision. I want to see this through to the end, I told her. Not just for me, but for all the other families Sophia has destroyed. And not just for justice, but to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Margaret nodded. What about Thomas? I thought about the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the garden, the teenager who called me every day during his first semester at college, the young man who held my hand at his father's funeral. Thomas will have to make his own choice about whether he wants to save himself or go down with her. But I won't sacrifice justice for other victims to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. Margaret smiled with satisfaction. Then tomorrow, we go to war. Rebecca Walsh is about to learn that underestimating Eleanor Whitmore was the biggest mistake of her career. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Margaret called at 7:30, her voice tight with excitement and concern. Eleanor, you need to get down to the courthouse immediately. Bradley Morrison just filed an emergency motion claiming that Thomas is being held against his will at the manor and that Sophia is preventing him from cooperating with investigators. I was already reaching for my clothes. What does that mean? It means Thomas may be trying to save himself, but Sophia isn't letting him. According to Bradley's filing, Thomas came to him yesterday wanting to accept the cooperation agreement. But when he returned to the house to get his things, Sophia threatened to destroy evidence that would implicate her unless he refused to testify. Can she do that? Not legally, but she can make his life hell and potentially drag him down with her if he doesn't play along. Bradley's asking for a protective order and police escort so Thomas can safely remove himself from the situation. I thought about the implications. If Thomas testifies against her, what happens to the case against him? That depends on what he has to say and how much evidence he can provide. If he's genuinely remorseful and helpful to the investigation, he might face reduced charges or even immunity. If he's just trying to save his own skin while minimizing his involvement, he'll still face significant consequences. An hour later, I found myself sitting in a courthouse waiting room while Margaret met with prosecutors, and Detective Morrison coordinated with federal agents who had joined the investigation. The case had grown beyond a simple elder abuse matter. into something that involved interstate commerce and organized criminal activity. Through the window, I could see news vans gathering in the courthouse parking lot. Word had leaked about the investigation, and reporters were starting to piece together the story of the elderly oil heiress who had uncovered a multi-million-dollar elder fraud network. Detective Morrison appeared in the waiting room looking like she hadn't slept in days. "Eleanor, I wanted to update you before you heard it from someone else. We arrested Sophia this morning on federal charges. She's been denied bail because of flight risk concerns." The news hit me with unexpected force. Despite everything she'd done, hearing that Sophia was in jail felt surreal. "What about Thomas?" "He's in protective custody while we sort out his level of cooperation. Bradley Morrison's with him now, and they're negotiating the terms of his testimony." Detective Morrison sat down beside me. "Eleanor, I need to prepare you for what's coming. This case is going to be front-page news, and you're going to be portrayed as either a hero who exposed elder abuse or a vindictive old woman who destroyed her own family. The defense is going to attack your credibility and your motives." I thought about the quiet life I'd lived before this nightmare began, the simple pleasures of tending my garden and preserving my family's legacy. I never wanted to be famous for this. I know. But sometimes circumstances choose us rather than the other way around. What you've done is going to help a lot of people, even if it comes at a personal cost. Margaret emerged from the prosecutor's office looking simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. "It's over," she announced. "Thomas is cooperating fully, and his testimony corroborates everything we suspected about Sophia's network. She's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. And Thomas? Probation and community service, contingent on his continued cooperation and testimony in related cases. He'll also have to make full restitution for any financial harm, though in your case there wasn't actual monetary loss." I felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Thomas would avoid prison, but our relationship might never recover from what he'd done and what I'd had to do to stop him. "There's one more thing," Margaret said quietly. "Thomas wants to see you. He's asked if you'll meet with him before he gives his formal statement." I looked out the window at the gathering media circus and thought about the simple breakfast I'd shared with Margaret just hours earlier. My life had changed irrevocably, and there was no going back to the quiet widowhood I'd been navigating just a week ago. "Yes," I said finally. "I'll see him. But not here, and not with attorneys or investigators present. If my son wants to apologize, he can do it the way he should have done it months ago, as a human being talking to his mother." Margaret nodded. "I'll arrange it. But Eleanor, you need to be prepared for the possibility that this conversation won't give you the closure you're hoping for. Sometimes the people we love the most are the least capable of acknowledging the harm they've caused us." I stood up and straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of everything that had brought me to this moment. "Then I guess we'll find out what kind of man I raised, won't we?" The meeting took place 3 days later in the small conference room at Margaret's law office, away from the media circus that had engulfed the courthouse. I arrived early, wanting time to compose myself before facing the son who had become a stranger to me over the past tumultuous week. Thomas walked in looking like he'd aged a decade in 7 days. His usual confident bearing was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders and hollow eyes of a man who'd watched his life implode. He wore a wrinkled shirt and needed a shave, and when he looked at me, I saw the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas." I gestured to the chair across from me, maintaining the distance that felt necessary. He sat down heavily and stared at his hands for a long moment before speaking. "I don't know where to begin. I don't know how to explain what happened or how I let things get so far out of hand. Start with the truth," I said simply. "When did you first know that Sophia was planning to have me declared incompetent?" Thomas flinched as if I'd slapped him. It wasn't like that at first. She made observations about how you were struggling after Dad died, how you seemed confused sometimes or overwhelmed by managing the house. Observations that weren't true. I thought they were, he said miserably. Or maybe I wanted to believe they were. It was easier to think you needed help than to admit that I didn't know how to help you grieve. I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd come to expect, but saw only genuine anguish. When did it change from concern to conspiracy? Thomas was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. The night she showed me the emails from the real estate developer. She said you were sitting on millions of dollars while struggling to maintain a house that was too big for you. She made it sound like we were saving you from a burden. By taking away my right to choose what to do with my own property. She said you'd thank us eventually, that you'd be happier in a smaller place with fewer responsibilities. His voice broke. I convinced myself that we were doing it for your own good. I felt a familiar rage building, but underneath it was something more painful, disappointment so deep it felt like physical injury. Thomas, do you hear yourself? You're talking about me like I was a child who couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions. I know that now, he said desperately. But at the time, Sophia was so convincing. She had explanations for everything, answers to every concern I raised. She made me feel like I was being a good son by protecting you from yourself. And the forged documents? The guardianship timeline? The plans to develop the property without my knowledge? Were those also for my own good? Thomas put his head in his hands. By the time I understood what we were really doing, I was already so deep in it that I didn't know how to get out. Sophia said if I backed out, she'd tell everyone that the whole thing was my idea. So you chose to betray your mother rather than face the consequences of your choices. I chose wrong, he admitted. I chose weakness over courage, and lies over loyalty. I chose a woman I'd known for months over the mother who raised me and loved me for 35 years. The pain in his voice was real, but it didn't diminish. My own hurt. Thomas, do you understand what you've done to us? To our relationship, to our family, to everything your father and I tried to build? I've destroyed it, he said simply. I've destroyed everything that mattered, and I don't know if there's any way to fix it. I leaned back in my chair, studying the man across from me who shared my eyes and William's stubborn chin. Tell me about the other families. Thomas looked confused. What other families? The ones Sophia targeted before she met you. The pattern of relationships with men who had elderly parents with substantial assets. Did you know about her history? His face went white. What history? For the next 20 minutes, I walked Thomas through everything the investigation had revealed about Sophia's background, her previous relationships, and the network of professionals who helped her target vulnerable elderly people. I watched. His expression changed from confusion to horror to devastating understanding. She researched our family before she met me, he whispered. 6 months before, according to the evidence. She knew about your father's death, about my assets, about the property values. She chose you specifically because you were grieving and vulnerable and had access to exactly what she wanted. Thomas stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking. I thought she loved me. I thought I was lucky to find someone so understanding about family obligations, so willing to help with difficult situations. She was good at her job, I said quietly. The investigators say she's one of the most sophisticated elder fraud specialists they've encountered. You weren't her first victim, and if she hadn't been stopped, you wouldn't have been her last. He turned back to me, and I saw a new kind of pain in his eyes, the realization that everything he'd believed about, his relationship had been a lie. Mom, I know I have no right to ask this, But I need you to know that when I started documenting your behavior, I genuinely thought I was helping you. I thought I was building a case for getting you the support you needed. By lying about my mental state? By interpreting your actions in the worst possible light, because that's what Sophia taught me to do. She'd point out every small mistake, every moment of confusion, every sign that you might be struggling, and she'd convince me it was evidence of decline rather than normal human behavior. I thought about the psychological manipulation Dr. Chen had described, the way abusers could distort reality until their victims questioned their own perceptions. Thomas, did it ever occur to you to talk to me directly about your concerns, instead of building a secret case against my competency? I tried once, he said miserably. Remember when I suggested we look at some assisted living brochures? You got upset, and Sophia said that reaction proved you weren't thinking clearly about your situation. I did remember that conversation, and how hurt I'd been by the suggestion that I needed managed care. What I was reacting to was the assumption that I couldn't manage my own life without being consulted about whether I wanted help. I see that now. But Sophia convinced me that your resistance to help was itself a symptom of the problem. The circular logic was maddening, but I could see how someone already predisposed to worry about an aging parent might be vulnerable to that kind of manipulation. Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. When you realized what Sophia was really doing, when you understood that this wasn't about helping me but about stealing from me, why didn't you come to me then? He sat back down looking defeated. Because I was terrified. Terrified that you'd never forgive me. Terrified that I'd go to prison. Terrified that everyone would know what a fool I'd been. Sophia convinced me that our only option was to see it through and hope that eventually you'd understand. So you chose self-preservation over doing the right thing. Yes, he said simply, and that's the choice I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of everything that had been said settling between us. I looked at my son and saw both the man who had betrayed me and the child I had loved unconditionally for 3.5 decades. What happens now, Thomas? I testify against Sophia and her network. I cooperate fully with the investigation and help them build cases against everyone involved. I do everything I can to make sure no other families go through what we've been through. And personally, what happens between us? Thomas's voice was barely audible. I don't know. I hope someday you might be able to forgive me, but I understand if you can't. I understand if you never want to see me again. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Austin skyline in the distance. Thomas, forgiveness isn't something I can give you today. Trust isn't something that can be rebuilt with an apology. Those things take time, and they require consistent actions, not just words. I know. But I want you to understand something. You're still my son. What you did was wrong, and it caused tremendous harm. But it doesn't erase 35 years of love. It doesn't make me stop caring about what happens to you. I turned, back to face him. However, our relationship will never be the same. You'll have to earn back my trust one day at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one authentic choice at a time. And there's no guarantee that you'll succeed. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. I understand. And Mom? I want you to know that testifying against Sophia isn't about saving myself. It's about finally doing the right thing, even if it's too late to matter. It's not too late to matter, I said firmly. It won't fix what you did to me, but it might prevent what she planned to do to other people. That matters, Thomas. That matters a great deal. 6 months later, I stood in my garden at Whitmore Manor, watching the sunrise paint the sky the same pink and gold that had greeted me on countless mornings over the past 4 decades. The house was quiet around me, truly quiet for the first time since Thomas and Sophia had moved in nearly a year earlier. The trial had ended 2 weeks ago with Sophia receiving a 25-year federal sentence for elder fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy charges. 3 other members of her network had also been convicted, and investigators were still pursuing cases in other states. Thomas had testified for 4 days, providing details that helped convict not just Sophia, but the entire organization she'd been part of. His own sentence had been lenient: 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service with elder advocacy organizations, and full restitution for any costs I'd incurred during the legal proceedings. The judge had noted his cooperation and what appeared to be genuine remorse, but had also made it clear that betraying one's own mother for financial gain was particularly reprehensible. I'd attended every day of the trial, watching my son rebuild, his credibility one truthful answer at a time. Sophia had refused to look at either of us, maintaining her innocence even as evidence mounted against her. Her attorney had tried to paint me as a vindictive old woman who had manipulated the justice system to punish her son's choice of partner, but the jury had seen through that strategy quickly. The media attention had been intense, but ultimately positive. I'd become something of a folk hero to advocates for elderly rights, and had received hundreds of letters from people who'd experienced similar family manipulation. Some had been inspired to seek help. Others had simply wanted to share their stories with someone who would understand. Margaret had suggested that I write a book about the experience, or at least allow someone else to tell the story as a warning to other families. I was considering it, though part of me wanted to simply return to the quiet life I'd been living before this nightmare began. Thomas had moved to Dallas after the trial, taking a job with a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to elderly victims of financial abuse. He called me once a week, usually on Sunday evenings, and we were slowly rebuilding some form of relationship. It wasn't the easy familiarity we'd once shared, but it was honest in a way that our interactions had never been before. He'd asked if he could visit for Christmas, and I'd told him I'd consider it. The truth was, I missed him terribly, but I also wasn't ready to pretend that everything was normal between us. Trust, as I'd told him, would take time to rebuild. Dr. Chen had recommended a therapist who specialized in family trauma, and I'd been seeing her regularly to work through the complex emotions that came with loving someone who had betrayed you so fundamentally. She'd helped me understand that healing didn't require me to minimize what had happened or to forgive before I was ready. Elena Rodriguez, my former housekeeper who had become an unexpected ally, had started her own cleaning service and was thriving. We had dinner together once a month, and she'd become one of my closest friends. She understood, in a way that few others could, what it meant to be underestimated and then to discover your own strength. The manor itself felt different now. Lighter, somehow despite the painful memories it now contained. I'd reclaimed every room, rearranging furniture and rehanging pictures to suit my own preferences rather than accommodating others. The servants' quarters where I'd been encouraged to take my meals had been converted into a small library where I could read and write in peace. I'd also made some changes to my will and estate planning, creating detailed protections against future manipulation while ensuring that the property would remain in family hands if Thomas ever proved himself worthy of that trust again. But I'd also established the charitable foundation I'd mentioned during that final confrontation, ensuring that regardless of what happened to family relationships, the land would be preserved for future generations. Standing in my garden that morning, coffee cup in hand, I reflected on everything that had changed and everything that had remained constant. I was still Eleanor Whitmore, widow of William, mother of Thomas, keeper of 4 generations of family history. But I was also something I'd never been before. A woman who knew exactly what she was worth and what she was willing to fight to protect. The roses William had planted were blooming magnificently, and I could almost hear his voice on the morning breeze, telling me he was proud of how I'd handled everything. He'd always said I was stronger than I knew, and it had taken a crisis to prove him right. My phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret, asking if I wanted to join her for lunch. In town. I smiled, thinking about how much my social life had expanded since I'd stopped allowing others to manage it for me. I had book club on Tuesday, volunteer work at the Historical Society on Wednesday, and dinner plans with Dr. Chen and her husband on Friday. At 72 years old, I was busier and happier than I'd been in years. Not because my circumstances were perfect, but because they were authentically mine. I finished my coffee and walked back toward the house, pausing at the fountain where I'd overheard the conversation that changed everything. If I hadn't been in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, I might never have learned what was being planned against me. The thought was chilling, but it also reminded me that sometimes the universe provides exactly what we need when we need it most. Inside the house, I could hear my phone ringing. It might be Thomas with his weekly call, or Margaret with legal updates, or any number of people who had become part of my expanded world. Whoever it was, I would answer with confidence, knowing that I was no longer vulnerable to manipulation or deception. I had learned the hardest lesson of my life: that love without boundaries is not really love at all, and that protecting yourself from those who would harm you is not cruelty, but wisdom. I had survived an attack on everything I held dear, and I had emerged stronger, clearer, and more certain of my own worth than ever before. Eleanor Whitmore had not just survived, she had prevailed. And that knowledge would sustain me through whatever challenges the future might hold. The phone continued ringing as I walked through my beautiful, peaceful, completely secure home, and I smiled as I reached for it. Whatever came next, I was ready. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.